Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Alternative Method Procedures, a key element of your lockout program, sponsored by Brady Software and Services. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. In a few minutes, we'll start the presentation, but first I want to go over some preliminary items. The views of today's speaker and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we will conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen and click the button for Submit Question. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we may not get to each one. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to submit a brief evaluation survey, which we'll discuss further when the presentation has concluded. This webcast is archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. And just a note, that's the word A-N-D in between safety and health and not an ampersand. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. Our speaker today will be Scott Stone. Scott brings more than 15 years of experience as a safety professional, and his expertise includes building safety management systems and inspection and auditing processes. Scott is a certified Six Sigma Black Belt for advanced statistical and problem-solving techniques to improve effectiveness and efficiency. Again, we thank all of you for tuning in today. And Scott, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about alternative methods and I guess some best practices that I've come across during my career, as a safety professional. Many companies, struggle with alternative procedures, and many times, they might end up leaving their employees at an increased risk level because they fully don't understand them, or I guess really just don't take the time to address them. In my career, I've personally struggled with tasks, that certain operators and maintenance professionals, get into, when they don't fully, and when they can't fully lock out a piece of equipment for whatever reason, it might be, and then determining, the best way to ensure their safety. All right. Next slide. Okay, so here's my agenda. I'll start with a little discussion on the applicability of these alternative procedures and really how they fit into the lockout standard 1910.147. We'll talk a little bit about the lockout equipment specific procedures, so the zero energy state procedures. I'll spend a little time on those and talk about some shortcomings, and then really the shortcomings as they relate to some of the alternate procedures that I'll be discussing, and then I'll spend the rest of the presentation really focused on the alternative procedures. So, but before I get into this, I do want to call something out. It's a great resource to make sure everyone's aware. It's a resource that I use extensively. Of course, we're always referring back to, the OSHA standard, 1910.147. Machine guarding, is very closely related to this. But there is another resource that I refer to quite often, and that's an OSHA directive. And it's an OSHA directive. The number is CPL 02-00-147. Again, CPL 02-00-147. And this is a directive or a manual that establishes OSHA's, really their enforcement policy for its standards addressing the control of hazardous energy, and it instructs their compliance officers, on the agency's, interpretations, of those standards and the procedures for enforcing them. So it kind of goes through all the stuff, kind of puts some of the stuff into plain language, gives really good examples, and pulls in all the different material that's kind of scattered out there, including the interpretation. So I highly recommend that as a resource, just as a guideline that you can go back and refer to. It's been very, very helpful to me. Okay, so let's start the discussion on the lockout standard. The lockout standard addresses, the safety of employees engaged in servicing and maintenance activities in general industry workplaces. The core of the standard, which permits employees to service equipment safely, is the shutdown and de-energization of the equipment and the isolation of those energy sources, and then locking them out, locking and tagging them out so they stay and they're under the personal control of that authorized employee. This is accomplished by following the energy control procedures, which I'll touch on briefly here next. But servicing and maintenance, which takes place during normal production operations, is covered by the standard if an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or another safety device, or an employee is required to place any part of their body, into the point of operation, or anywhere where there's another associated danger zone that exists during that machine's operating cycle. Now, OSHA does recognize circumstances in which some discrete servicing and maintenance activities are going to be performed without locking out the machinery or equipment. The first one that I'll discuss here is minor servicing. OSHA defines minor servicing as minor tool changes and adjustments and other minor activities which take place during normal production operations. So they're not covered if they meet that minor servicing standard if they are considered routine, repetitive, and integral to the use of the equipment for production, provided that the work is performed using, and this is where they bring in those alternative procedures, provided that the work is performed using alternative measures which provide effective protection. And what is effective protection? A lot of times that's where we start talking about machine guarding. Subpart O, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. It does not say that you don't have to do anything. If you meet minor servicing, you can do whatever you want. You still have to provide adequate protection to those employees, and those adequate protections are known as those alternative measures. The second one that I want to touch on there at the bottom of the slide is testing and positioning. OSHA recognizes that, lockout devices, often must be temporarily removed, for periods of time to permit, testing or positioning. So, a maintenance professional might be into a job and, they need to check to see whatever work that they're doing is actually working. So they need to re-energize that piece of equipment. And OSHA in the standard, it outlines the different steps that need to be followed, for those employees that are going to test and position. The standard does not allow the employer or the employee to disregard the requirement for lockout, before, or after, that testing and positioning. However, employers must provide, and those employees working on the job, adequate protection when it's not possible to remove an employee from the danger area. So when you read the standard and all that, you need to remove, yourself from that danger area when you are testing and positioning. But they also provide, a little guidance on when it is not feasible, where they cannot completely remove themselves from that area. They still have to provide adequate protection, from that hazard while testing and positioning. So fixed guarding, different things that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but you just can't put an employee at risk. That's plain and simple. Whatever that employee's doing, they cannot be exposed to hazardous energy. They have to be protected. And the third, the last bullet there, I kind of threw it in as other activities when lockout is not feasible. And this is kind of where it gets a little muddy and a little gray. But some activities properly are classified as servicing and or maintenance under the OSHA definition, but they're minor in nature and performed during normal production operations. So operations such as lubricating, draining sumps, servicing filters, making simple adjustments, maybe inspecting for leaks and maybe malfunction while the piece of equipment is running. Those are some examples of routine servicing and maintenance activities, which often can be accomplished safely, with effective production type mode safeguards. And those safeguards, referring to as, machine guarding, approved machine guarding safeguards. These services do not require extensive disassembly, of the machinery or equipment. There's a level. Once you start, getting your tools out, you start digging in the piece of equipment, all bets are off there. So the lockout standard and other general industry standards, they're intended to supplement each other. Again, like machine guarding, that can be used, as an effective alternative to lockout. If those alternative measures eliminates employee exposure to the hazardous energy. As a general principle, the lockout standard does not apply to servicing and maintenance activities when employees are not exposed to hazardous energy. And there's, many different ways that, employees can be protected from, workplace injuries and fatalities. And, number one, always, if it can be done, when in doubt, lock it out. If there is no reason to not lock it out, lock the piece of equipment out. The other, complying with the minor servicing exception, which we'll talk about. And the effective machine guarding, in compliance with Subpart O, that prevents that employee exposure. All right, just briefly, lockout procedures, just to kind of bring this into the mix. OSHA requires that procedures be developed and documented for the control of potentially hazardous energy. So these are the equipment-specific procedures, or you call them zero energy state procedures. Lockout procedures. A lot of different names for these procedures. And of course, there's exceptions, within the standard when you don't need these procedures. But that's really not the intent of my presentation today. So here's an example of a machine-specific lockout procedure. These procedures are critical for the safety of the worker. They're critical for the safety of the authorized employee that's performing the work on that piece of equipment. Without procedures, workers run the risk of skipping steps during the lockout process. It gives them the roadmap, the guidelines, the information. It could lead to skipping steps, like I said, and lead to a serious incident, serious accident, injury, even fatality. There's a lot of very bad injuries and fatalities that have occurred that occur all the time because it related to lock tag out. But having these procedures isn't enough. Yes, they need to be visually intuitive, step by step. Make them easy to understand for the authorized workforce. Talk a little bit about that. But it's very important that they be machine and task specific. And that's kind of where I'm going to talk a little bit about is the task specific piece. This is where many companies run into problems. The procedures address, like the one that you see here on the screen, they address and provide instruction for full lockout tagout. They're providing instruction for bringing it down to a zero energy state, locking everything out, and everything. So it's at a zero energy state. But nothing exists for alternative methods. What about the work where they interact with the equipment, where you're not bringing it down to a zero energy state. Many times, though, there are protection measures in place and they're followed. They're just not documented, and then maybe not being documented and maybe not being validated. And since I have you here, I can't pass up an opportunity to talk a little bit about some common failures with, procedures themselves, and then I'll get on with it after this. But also, tie it into the alternate methods here a little bit. But they are related, so I do want to spend some time on it. Some common failures that definitely I've seen with lockout procedures. I get out in industry quite a bit and review a lot of different programs, but generic procedures, is a big one. Either from a full lockout procedure to an alternative procedure, but very generic. Adding a statement in the preventative maintenance, work order, saying, hey, lock equipment out. While it's a great reminder, it doesn't provide, enough information. Or, just listing the basic, OSHA regulatory version, for, shut down and start up, listing the basic steps, but not specific to the equipment. Out-of-date procedures, this is a huge one, sustainability and all those things when equipment moves or it's modified, things change, not having an adequate review process in place is a big failure. And again, this is with any procedure that might be out there that you're utilizing. Omitting energy sources, missing the stored energy or the residual energy and how to control it is a big one. Overly complicated. I've seen some procedures, for a pretty, simplistic piece of equipment with, maybe a couple electrical, pneumatic energy sources, and it's a five-page document. Christmas is coming up. I got small kids, and I think many of us have, had that gift that we had to put together that, you about wanted to pull your hair out because the instructions were, maybe too detailed, and then also maybe too detailed, but maybe missing some steps and things like that. It makes you not want to use that instructional guide, and you're going to figure it out on your own. Type of thing. So, although, seemingly thorough, the ones that are too complicated and difficult to understand, it's going to make those employees not want to follow it. You have to make it more convenient for them and something that you can train to. Also, not readily available, procedures. And I don't care if you're talking about alternative procedures, full lockout procedures, they have to be readily available. To that worker that's going to be utilizing them. What does readily available mean? Close proximity to the equipment that they need to lock out, or that equipment that they have to perform minor servicing on, or whatever that means, whatever interaction they have with that piece of equipment. It has to be readily available to them so they can utilize it. When they can't find, the procedures, they sometimes, they'll proceed without them. And it's very common out there. I see it all the time for, different procedures and things. Companies spend all the time and effort to go through the process to develop them, and then they end up in a binder in the back of the maintenance shop, or they end up on a shared drive somewhere, and you ask, hey, where are your procedures? And oh my God, well, we used to have them, and they have to be out, they have to be readily available. Lack of verification steps, pretty self-explanatory with that one. And then not listing lockout devices. I'll be focusing the rest of the presentation really on the last bullet. Many companies are, they're focused on, like I said before, the zero energy procedures, and not focused on those other tasks, that put employees at risk and require an alternative procedure. These tasks include minor servicing that we talked about, testing and positioning, those other activities where full lockout is, might not be feasible. So alternative procedures. So we're going to start talking about these a bit. When full lockout's not achievable, alternative procedures must be provided that ensures employee safety, and the level of protection must provide the same level of protection as full lockout. So again, I reviewed many programs out in the industry, and while there is a big gap with the lockout procedure, the zero energy state procedures, I've seen a much bigger gap with the alternative method procedures. It's very common for companies to just accept certain activities as minor servicing without going through the correct process, and to validate, to ensure that they have the right safety measures in place, to protect those employees. Without doing that, they can unknowingly put employees at risk. There are also many behavior challenges that I think I need to talk about with lockout itself, and definitely challenges as they relate to alternative procedures. One of the things that I hear, and something as a safety professional kind of makes you cringe every time you hear it. It's the well, we've always done it this way. The we've always done it this way mentality. I've always reached into that part of the machine to adjust this or that. Or I always just use an interlock guard to perform maintenance on this piece of equipment. This is the way we've always done it. We got to keep production going, or whatever it might be. It's a big red flag. I haven't been hurt yet, so it must be okay. I've done it 1,000 times. I've done it for years. Just because it's always been done that way does not mean it's the right way. Sometimes this type of mentality can be hard to change. Very difficult to change, because it might be accepted for a long period of time, years, decades. But it shouldn't take a significant event to take a deep look, at your internal processes to identify those gaps and or that at-risk behavior. But when it becomes accepted, it gets passed down to new employees, and again, it just becomes very hard to change. We don't have the time. Is another one. It takes too long to do it the right way. How do you expect us to make any money? A lot of times alternative procedures that we're going to talk about, they can definitely aid in that. Where you can use them to help with that. Utilize them, use them. There are situations where you don't have to lock the machine out, but those situations where you should be locking the machines out, or maybe you don't have the right protective measures in place, those have to be identified, and you can't use the excuse that it takes too long. You get someone killed, and that would have took an extra 5 minutes. That's not going to fly. I don't think you ever want to put yourself in that situation. An employer who requires employees to perform servicing or maintenance while the machine is operating in the production mode, it has to provide that employee protection. Again, operations like lubricating, draining sumps, servicing filters, making simple adjustments, inspecting for leaks or malfunction. Again, these are examples of things that have to be done in a production mode for whatever reason. Again, we'll talk about the validation, the feasibility, and all that stuff. But a lot of times they can be accomplished with those effective safeguarding. All right, next slide. All right, so what's the process for getting into alternative procedures, and kind of where do you start? That's kind of the list that I have up here. The first thing, start with an initial task inventory. This is another common mistake, and it's not fully understanding the tasks that your employees engage in on a daily, weekly, a monthly basis. How are they interacting with that piece of equipment? You need to understand that in order to ensure that they are adequately protected. Are you leaving it up to the operator to determine if the task requires lockout, or the maintenance guy? I was in the facility here a couple months ago, and that's what it was. Sometimes they locked out, rarely. Other times, they relied on interlock guards actually going into the machine where they didn't have control of the interlock and utilizing that for lockout tagout. But it was really up to the maintenance professional to determine, hey, should I lock it out or not? And most of the time they were going towards not locking it out because it saved them time. But they never went through the process to identify what are these tasks that they're doing. But so you have to do your due diligence here to make sure that you're identifying those tasks. So you have to start with an initial task inventory. This is a full review of how your employees are interacting with the equipment. Determine what pieces of equipment needs an alternative method procedure. These tasks include all the minor servicing tasks where currently your employees are relying on some type of machine guarding to interact with the equipment, or maybe they're not currently relying on machine guarding, but they're still interacting with the equipment. But those situations where they're not locking out that piece of equipment in maintenance, with their minor tasks that they do to support production. A lot of times in minor servicing, you focus heavily on the operators and only the operators. But a lot of times the maintenance organization, they're just not coming in there, to do the major repairs, the stuff that would require full lockout. But there, can be a support function where a lot of their day is focused on, keeping the machine running in production mode, which requires some of those minor tasks, that could meet that minor servicing exception. Get the right people involved. The subject matter experts are key. Those that are familiar with the equipment and the energy sources involved. I've been out, I've written, procedures and helped with, minor servicing and things like that. But I've never been the expert on the equipment, that I'm looking at. I always pull in, those the team, the operators, maintenance, the supervisors. They're the ones that know. What's going on and how they're interacting with those pieces of equipment. So very, very important, to make sure that you get help and you really get the right people involved as you start this. And then I'm going to talk about here these next bullets. I'm going to give them their own slide here. So justification study. So I refer a lot to the ANSI ASSE Z244.1. They have a new draft, 2016, that's getting ready to come out. And I also utilize the older one that they had, but a fantastic resource. They spent a lot of time and a lot of effort, really focused on alternative measures, and they get into great detail, much more detail than I'm gonna get in here today with you. But another great resource, Z244.1. But one of the things that it has in there